Okay, here we are looking at research ethics for COM 400. We're going to particularly look at two experiments to start with, anyway, in particular that showed the necessity of having rules of ethics for research. The first one is the Milgram experiment. Now, these are pretty famous experiments. In fact, if you have had a psychology course here at Bradley, you may have heard about one or both of these experiments. One of these experiments has had several movies, not this one, but the next one we're going to look at, and has been, I think, one movie, full-length movie, is still available on Netflix. It was a few years ago. It was also in the movie theaters. But let's start with this. This was the Milgram experiment. Here's a picture of Stanley Milgram, who was the researcher who set up this experiment. It was done to try to explain Nazi prison guards' behavior. Now, in the 1960s, when this was done, World War II had not been that far off, and people, when they found out about what had happened in the Holocaust, could not figure out why prison guards had behaved so inhumanely. And so this experiment was to look and see why people sometimes would do terrible things. For this particular experiment, volunteers were brought in, and the volunteers were made to believe that they shocked people for getting wrong answers. What they did was they had a machine. You can see the machine in the background, actually, that still is, I believe, still on display at the university. It was actually not connected to anything, but supposedly the volunteers thought that they could give shocks to a person on another side of a screen or in another room that they could hear if that person gave the wrong answer. Now, what was actually happening was this wasn't connected with anything. The person in the other room was an actor who pretended to get shocked. Milgram just wanted to find out why, how people would react, how far they'd be willing to go, and so that was how the experiment was set up. The scary thing is that most of them did it. Most of them went through and put it to the highest amount of electricity, and you'll see in the video that you watch, this 6.5-minute video, that they, even when the person seemed to have had a heart attack or blacked out, many of them continued to do it. Two people in the video that you see did not go all the way, but those were actually anomalies. That most of the people actually did it, which is kind of a scary thing to think. The researcher found that the people blamed the authority when they did it. They said, well, I thought this person is in charge, they're a professional, they should know, so I can just go ahead and do this. And that was one of the findings that came about. So what I'd like to invite you to do is to go ahead and look at that Milgram video in the video link. That is actual footage taken of the experiment in the 1960s using cell and black and white film, or film rather, and with the film cells, no digital. And so take a look at that, and it was one of the first ones that when people saw it, the experiment did find something, but the interesting thing was that people said were outraged and angry about it. So go ahead and take a look at that video. Now, the second experiment is the Stanford experiment, and this gentleman here who looks like an evil scientist, actually some people think he is a little bit evil. He is, his name is Zimbardo, and he was in charge of the Stanford experiment. Now, the Stanford experiment had subjects, volunteers, divided into two groups. They were guards and prisoners. Now, they wanted to find out the same thing that Milgram did, as far as why prison guards had done what they had done, why sometimes people are influenced to do things that are not good. So they got some college students. They paid them a very small sum, and told them they were going to do an experiment, a prison experiment. They didn't even know what was going to happen, but after they agreed, suddenly the police showed up at their homes, some of them at their places of work, handcuffed, their hands behind their back, and brought them in. Were fingerprinted just as if they were prisoners, and they were taken to this university makeshift prison. So it was a shock from the very beginning. One of the things that turned out was that those volunteers, college students who had been assigned to be guards, began to become abusive. Now we're going to show shortly a clip, or there will be a link for a clip on Sakai. And if you watch that, it's about 2 minutes. It shows some of the treatment. Now, there was a lot worse treatment than what you see in the clip, and it's available on the internet. It just, I think, is sad, and I didn't think we needed to see the whole thing to see what actually was happened. But the guards became very abusive. One prisoner had a mental breakdown, and finally, the experiment was stopped before it finished because of the detrimental effects it was having on the people who were playing the prisoners. The interesting thing is Zimbardo seems not to, he doesn't apologize for this at all. In fact, he didn't even want to stop the experiment until his girlfriend, who was a former student of his, indicated she was going to break up with him if he did not stop the experiment. So he did. So people, when they heard about this, said this is research going too far. You're actually, just like the Milford experiment, you are going too far. So go ahead and watch that video link. It does end abruptly. It's actually a cut of a longer documentary, but that will give you an idea of what actually went on with the Stanford experiment. Now we're going to look at experimental techniques and the treatment of data. Now, you might look at this and think, I thought we were going to talk about ethics. Well, we are going to continue. That's part of this. And part of ethical research is making sure the techniques are ethical and the way you treat the data is ethical. So let's take a look at that. Researchers use standard accepted methods. And I'm going to stop there for a minute, but standard accepted methods mean methods that have been used in the past. So they have been tested and tried, and the research community has said these are valid. There have been published studies. An example would be when I've done third-person effect research, for all the published studies I've done, every one of them, I would say I'm using the method first started by Davison in 1983 in his landmark study, where he founded the first-person effect idea concept theory, and has been used throughout research since that time. So it's a very standard accepted technique. In fact, there was another technique that came along that was supposed to be better, and then it was basically debunked, and now they say don't ever use that method. It was called the Diamond method. It was very interesting because I got to see in real time that another method came out, and then other people said, actually, this doesn't work. So they still use that same old method. So researchers use standard accepted methods for greater acceptance, so that people will accept that. Otherwise, they're going to look and say, we don't know that this method is valid, so we can't accept that. Now we're going to talk about cold fusion. And this is a good example in the National Institutes of Health, in their brochure that they give out to students and researchers who are doing research, and they talk about ethics, and they say, here's how to use ethical research. This is one of the examples they give, and I like it because I was around when this took place. So I was fairly young, and on the news, they said there was a new scientific invention that would revolutionize the world, would revolutionize energy. You wouldn't need to have hydroelectric dams. You wouldn't need to have all these sources of power. They could basically pull power from water, energy. And they called this cold fusion. There were two scientists who came up with it. Some researchers were skeptical. They thought this is a pretty big jump when people have researched this for a long time, but they did examine it. Now, cold fusion research claims were doubted, one, because it hadn't been done before, they thought it would be difficult, but also because methods used were strange and difficult to replicate. They did try to replicate those, and every time they replicated it, they didn't get the same results. Finally, they figured that the two scientists really didn't know what they were doing. They weren't trying to perpetrate a scam, but they didn't really have the the technique down to actually do this. Basically, the research had flaws that are kind of, you might think of it this way, the equivalent of having dirty test tubes, and so it was tainted, and it was false. Maybe not. They might have not have been scam artists, but they certainly were sloppy. So this is the Time magazine article, or the front page when it came out. It's Fusion or Illusion, how two obscure chemists stirred excitement and outrage in the scientific world. So when the methods were finally understood, cold fusion claims were disregarded. So that's why it's very important to have standard methods that have been used before, because otherwise your research is not going to be it's not going to be credible. And I have seen research studies where I've been reviewing for a publication, doing peer reviews, and the methods were something I had not seen before, and I said, well, we can't actually use these methods. This is not credible because this isn't a standard method. Okay, we're going to look at methods in exploratory research, continuing methods in research, but we're going to pick up on that in our next video.